This video is that John Kennedy is going to expose showing Obama and the whole Democrat Party created this mess, and we American people are now seeing it. Even though they say they didn't create it, but it has been true and fact. So let's get into the video, shall we?
Mr. President, I wish I could stand here today and tell you that the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, had worked.
Senator John Kennedy just went straight to the Senate floor and tore Obamacare apart piece by piece. Not with slogans, not with spin, with facts, premium numbers, canceled plans, and real Americans getting crushed.
I wish I could sit here and tell you today that the American people were better off as a result of the Affordable Care Act. But I can't do that. And it gives me no joy in having to make that statement. Now, as you know, Mr. President, not a single Republican voted for the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act was passed at President Obama's suggestion by the Democratic members of the House and the Senate. They had a majority, and in this body, the majority rules. And I don't want to ascribe to the President or to our Democratic friends any ill motives whatsoever. They wanted what was best for the American people. It wasn't a question of bad motives. It was just a bad idea. It didn't work. And let me say this another way. I believe that President Obama and our colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle in the United States Senate and in the United States House of Representatives passed Obamacare with the best of intentions. But you know what? 150 years ago, Mr. President, I know you also happen to be a physician. 150 years ago, doctors used to bleed their patients with the best of intentions. And they stopped doing that. They did it. They didn't have any bad motives in doing it. They did it because they thought it would help the patient. It killed many of them. So they stopped doing it. You know, we were told when the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, I don't mean any disrespect in calling it Obamacare. President Obama himself refers to it as Obamacare. When the United States Congress, the Democrats in the United States Congress passed Obamacare, I remember well what we were told, because I wanted to believe it. The president said, I'm going to quote, he said, if you like your insurance plan, you can keep your insurance plan. I think he meant that at the time. It wasn't true. Turned out not to be true. The president said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. I think that's what he wanted, but you couldn't. He said the Affordable Care Act would, quote, cover every American and cut the cost of a typical family's premium by up to $2,500 a year. Not even close. He said, President Obama said, Obamacare would, quote, bend the cost curve for health care. He said, without adding, quote, one dime to the deficit. None of that was true. I think the president meant it at the time. I think he wanted it at the time. I know I did. I know you did, Mr. President. But it just turned out not to be true. Now, the simple fact of the matter is, and I think every reasonable person has to conclude, that the Affordable Care Act has not worked for the American people. Let's talk about the exchanges. As you know, Mr. President, there are two parts of the Affordable Care Act. There are the exchanges through which people go and buy insurance directly from an insurance company. And then there's the Medicaid expansion. I want to talk about the exchanges for a moment. In 2016, under Obamacare, we started out with 281 insurance companies offering insurance to the American people. Good start. The problem is now we have 141. And they're dropping like flies. In my state, Louisiana, we're down to 3. A third of all of the counties in America have only one choice. One insurance company that will still write insurance. And many of our counties have zero, none, nada, zilch. They can't get insurance at all. They've been given a bus ticket, but there's no bus. In Louisiana, let me talk just for a moment about my state, our state, Mr. President. In Louisiana, premiums have gone up 123% on the exchanges since 2013. That's an average of $3,600 increase per plan. Nationwide, the average Obamacare plan now costs 105% more than when it started. That's $3,000 per person. And what's particularly incredible to me, Mr. President, you know these statistics better than I do. In Louisiana, we have 136,000 people who, rather than buying insurance off the exchanges, have chosen to pay the fine. Let me say that again. 136,000 people in my state have looked at the insurance offered to them with the subsidies and said, we'd rather pay the fine. Of that 136,000 who said, I'll pick the fine instead of the insurance, of that 136,000,
imagine being able to build an app with your name on it just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44, a complete AI creation platform. Describe what you want and watch it take shape. You can plan, customize, and expand in any direction. From tools built for one to platforms ready for many. From passion projects to enterprise-grade systems. Everything is built in and ready to launch. It's a new world of creation where you can go as far as your imagination takes you. Can you imagine it? Let's make your dream a reality right now.
Yep, it's called a home equity agreement, and I got $143,000 for my home equity without monthly payments.
Y'all ever heard of a home equity agreement? It's quickly becoming one of the go-to ways to tap into your home equity for homeowners who need cash and don't want monthly payments. They've already helped over 14,000 homeowners tap into their home's built-up equity without adding monthly payments, refinancing, or selling their home. Here's how it works. They ask a few simple questions about your home and your goals, then they tell you how much cash you may qualify for. I first found out about this from my neighbor, Raymond. About 2 years ago, he used it when his bills were stacking up and his bank kept denying him for a HELOC. He used the same site and ended up unlocking
84% of them make $50,000 or less. 48% of them, half, make $25,000 or less. Now, you know what that tells me? That tells me that 136,000 people in my state, most of whom are too poor to be sick, looked at the Affordable Care Act plan and said, we can't afford it. We'd rather pay the fine. We're better off paying the fine. So they're out of pocket the money for the fine, and they still don't have insurance. No reasonable person would call that a success. Let me give you a couple more examples, Mr. President, because we talk around here in concepts, and we all know what we're talking about, but the average American who gets up every day and goes to work and obeys the law and pays his taxes or her taxes and tries to do the right thing by their kids and tries to save some money for retirement, they don't have time to deal in concepts. They're too busy earning a living. They just want to know, what kind of health insurance do I have and what's it going to cost? So let me give you some examples right now from Louisiana. This is brought to you by the Affordable Care Act. Let's suppose I'm a 60-year-old, non-smoking male living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm making $50,000 a year, Mr. President. According to healthcare.gov, I didn't make this up. According to healthcare.gov, the cheapest and most basic plan available to me would cost me $689.85 $2.14 a month with a $4,500 deductible for a grand total of $9,000 a year. Deductible by out of pocket plus my premiums. Now I'm 60 years old. I'm living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the cost of living isn't that high. I'm making $50,000, and the federal government has said, we've got a great deal for you. Hey, give us $9,000, and then if we might be able to give you some health care. For that $9,000, what do I get? Let's suppose I say, okay, here's my $9,000. I don't know where I'm going to find it. I'm only making $50,000 a year, and of course the government's taking some of that for taxes. But I find $9,000 a year. You know what I get? I get 4 doctor visits. I get 2 lab tests. I get 9 prescription drugs and additional medical costs for a grand total of $100. That's not insurance, Mr. President. That's giving somebody a bus ticket without a bus. All right, let's suppose I'm a 50-year-old female. I don't smoke. I'm living in Lafayette, Louisiana, which, as you know, is to the west of Baton Rouge. I'm making $50,000 a year over in Lafayette. The most basic plan in Lafayette, once again, I'm 50 years old, so I'm not 60 now. I'm 50 years old. I'm a female. I don't smoke. The most basic plan, the cheapest plan I could get would cost me $450 a month in premiums with a $4,800 deductible for a grand total of $6,550. So I've got to come into my pocket for $6,550 before I can get any kind of health insurance. Mr. President, that's not health insurance. And I would remind you, you know this, Mr. President, as a physician who's been on the front lines caring for people in our charity hospital system in Louisiana, and God bless you for that. You know as well as I do that the options I just described, they're the cheap ones. They're the most affordable ones. That's the best case scenario. Nobody wanted this, Mr. President. I know President Obama didn't want it to turn out this way. I know our friends on the Democratic side didn't. They wanted what was best for America. It wasn't a bad motive. It's just a bad idea. What do we need, Mr. President? Everybody has their own opinion of that. That's what we're going to try to convince each other of for over the next few days as we vote. I'll tell you what I think we need. I think in the healthcare delivery system, we don't need more government. I know some of my friends on the Democratic side, they think they have the solution. And I respect them for all the time and care they put into this. But some of my friends on the Democratic side say we've got the solution. Government has failed, we'll admit. They don't say it very loudly. But they'll privately say, we realize government has failed with Obamacare. And our prescription to fix it is more government. So let's go to a single-payer system. Let's have the federal government be in charge of everybody's health care. And let's let the federal government regulate our doctors and our nurses and our hospitals and our health insurance companies and our patients and our lab techs like they were utilities.
Never drive off immediately after filling your tank. What happens in those first few minutes is the reason your gas disappears so fast. If you own a car made after 2001, you need to hear this. I never post stuff like this, but I had to share. My parents lived 600 miles away. For 2 years, they barely visited their grandkids because of gas costs. Then last month, they showed up 3 times. I asked my mom what changed. She pulled out this little device from her purse, smaller than a phone charger. She said, we don't spend a fortune on gas anymore to see.
Mr. President, I've lived under a system like that. England has a system like that. You can't name me a single G20 country, not one, that has a single-payer system that's working. It's not the answer. Mr. President, quickly, because I'm running out of time here, here's what we need.
The senator's time is expired.
I will conclude then, Mr. President. Thank you for your time and attention. America needs a health care delivery system and deserves it, like somebody designed the dadgum thing on purpose.
President.
If you're wondering why so many Americans completely lost trust in Washington when it comes to healthcare, that speech from John Kennedy explains almost all of it. Because what Kennedy did on that Senate floor wasn't just criticize a law. He dismantled the entire sales pitch behind Obamacare piece by piece, promise by promise, statistic by statistic. And what made the speech powerful is that he didn't sound angry. He sounded disappointed. That's what gave it weight. He even went out of his way to say he didn't think Barack Obama or Democrats had bad intentions. He repeatedly said they wanted to help people. But then he delivered the line that defined the entire speech. It wasn't a question of bad motives. It was just a bad idea. That's the part Democrats hated hearing because Kennedy wasn't arguing emotions. He was arguing outcomes, and outcomes are hard to spin. Remember what Americans were told when Obamacare was being pushed through Congress. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. If you like your insurance plan, you can keep your insurance plan. Premiums would go down by thousands, competition would increase, healthcare would become affordable and accessible. The media treated those promises like guarantees. Democrats treated them like settled facts. Critics were mocked as fearmongers for warning that the system could spiral into exactly the problems Kennedy described. Then reality hit. Plans were canceled. Doctors disappeared from networks. Premiums exploded in many states. Deductibles became outrageous. Insurance providers started fleeing exchanges because the economics didn't work. And suddenly millions of Americans realized the affordable care they were promised wasn't affordable at all. That's why Kennedy's speech connected with so many working-class Americans. He wasn't speaking like a policy professor. He was speaking like somebody explaining basic common sense. If your premium is sky high, your deductible is enormous, and your coverage barely helps you unless something catastrophic happens, people don't feel insured. They feel trapped. That's why his Louisiana examples hit so hard. He walked through real numbers. 60-year-old man making $50,000 being expected to come up with nearly $9,000 before meaningful coverage even kicked in. A woman in Lafayette facing thousands in out-of-pocket costs before insurance truly helped her. And Kennedy kept emphasizing something important that Washington elites often ignore. Most Americans don't spend their lives obsessing over healthcare policy debates. They just want to know one thing: can I afford this or not? That's it. They don't care about political branding. They don't care about think tank language. They care whether healthcare is crushing their family budget. And for many middle-class Americans during the Obamacare years, especially those who didn't qualify for major subsidies, the answer became painfully obvious: no. They couldn't afford it. One of the strongest moments in Kennedy's speech came when he talked about the number of people in Louisiana choosing to pay the Obamacare penalty instead of buying the insurance itself. Think about how absurd that is. The federal government created a system where hundreds of thousands of people looked at the available plans and decided paying a punishment fee made more financial sense than purchasing the coverage being offered. That should have been a massive warning sign to everyone in Washington. But instead of admitting the system had serious structural problems, Democrats often doubled down and insisted Americans simply needed even more government involvement in healthcare. That's when Kennedy shifted into the broader philosophical argument. And honestly, this is where the debate still exists today. Kennedy basically argued that Obamacare failed because Washington believed government could centrally manage a system as massive and personal as healthcare without creating enormous distortions. The more rules, mandates, regulations, and federal controls added into the system, the more expensive and unstable things became. And when the exchanges started collapsing in some areas, Democrats responded with the same answer they always return to: more federal control, more spending, more bureaucracy, more centralized authority. That's why Kennedy warned about the push towards single-payer healthcare. He argued that if Obamacare already struggled under partial government management, giving Washington total control over healthcare would only make the problems worse. Now, whether you agree with that or not, you can understand why so many conservatives saw Obamacare as proof that government expansion creates dependency, inefficiency, and rising costs instead of solving problems. And here's the part that still frustrates many Americans years later. People who designed Obamacare rarely suffered from the system they created. Politicians in Washington still had excellent health care. Media elites defending the law still had premium coverage. But ordinary workers, small business owners, self-employed Americans, and middle-class families were the ones dealing with the rising premiums and shrinking choices. That disconnect fueled enormous resentment across the country. It's also part of why anti-establishment politics exploded during that era. Americans got tired of being told by experts that everything was improving while their own bills kept getting worse. That frustration didn't just affect healthcare. It spilled into almost every major political issue in America. People stopped trusting institutions. They stopped trusting media narratives. And they especially stopped trusting massive promises coming out of Washington. Kennedy understood that mood perfectly. That's why his speech sounded less like a traditional Senate speech and more like a frustrated taxpayer venting on behalf of regular Americans who felt ignored. Even his old-school Louisiana phrasing made the message more effective because it sounded real instead of scripted. And his closing line may have been the best summary of the entire Obamacare debate. He said America deserves a healthcare system that looks like somebody, designed the dadgum thing on purpose. That line landed because millions of Americans felt like Obamacare was held together with political talking points instead of practical reality. Now obviously healthcare remains one of the hardest issues in America because everybody agrees the old system had problems too. Costs were already rising before Obamacare. Coverage gaps already existed. Insurance companies were already unpopular. But Kennedy's point was that Obamacare didn't solve those problems the way Americans were promised it would. In many cases, it simply replaced old frustrations with new ones. And that's why this speech still resonates years later. Because it captured the moment many Americans realized that good intentions and emotional speeches don't automatically create workable policy. Sometimes Washington politicians become so obsessed with passing something historic that they stop asking whether the system will actually function for the people forced to live under it. And when reality finally catches up, ordinary Americans are the ones stuck paying the price. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and